Hello, everyone. We are going to get started. Welcome, welcome. Looks like we've got people streaming in. That's fantastic. Glad you are here. Okay, we're pulling everybody in from the waiting room into the webinar, and it takes just a minute to get everybody in here. I don't want anybody to miss any of the goodness that we're going to be covering today. So welcome. Glad you're all here. Okay. Looks like we are good to go. So just a reminder that this session is being recorded. And so I'm excited to teach you some things and excited to answer your questions live, but just know that those questions are going to be answered live, and then this is going to be recorded. Okay, it looks like we've got everybody out of the waiting room. So a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, I see several of you raising your hand. Stop. Okay, it just keeps popping up a bubble on my screen, and that's going to slow things down a little bit. So do not click the raise hand button. What you're going to want to do is click the chat button in your Zoom menu. And that's where you're going to be able to tell us where you're from, and I hope you do, and whether or not you have already taken an AncestryDNA test. So if you've already taken an AncestryDNA test, let us know, or if you're just here because you want to learn more about it. So if you've taken a test and you want to learn more about it, or if you haven't taken a test and you want to learn more about it. So that's what I'd love to hear from you in the chat about. Looks like we've got people from all over. Some of you have taken the test. A few of you have not. Okay, that's great. That's going to help me know a little bit how to chat with you. Okay, and then it looks like you also should have a Q&A button. So that Q&A button in your menu is where you're going to ask me specific questions about AncestryDNA, but this is important. This is an AncestryDNA 101 class. So this is a getting started, getting to know basic DNA, how it works, what you get with your results. So if you have a more advanced question, there are lots of places that you can go to ask those. Ancestry does have a Facebook page. You can ask us questions there. We've got a YouTube channel, and you can go there. I've done a few videos on some more advanced DNA topics. You can find those and ask the questions in the comments there. Of course, you can also find me all over social media and lots of ways to interact with me and with other members of the Ancestry staff. So the Q&A today is specifically for AncestryDNA 101 questions. And some of those questions I may answer as we go. We're going to spend an hour together today. And we're going to cover 4 things. So we're first going to talk about DNA inheritance. We're going to talk a little bit about how DNA is inherited. It might feel like you're going back to junior high science class, but we can all use a little bit of a refresher. That foundational information is going to be important so that we can build on it to help you understand what to do with your DNA results to make more family history discoveries. And then we are going to talk about origins, and we're going to talk about your regions, and we're going to talk about your settings, and then we're going to talk about your matches. Okay, so inheritance, origins, including regions and journeys, the settings in your DNA kit, and matches. So those are the things that we are going to talk about today. Okay, I think we're all in. You're all telling me where you're from and that you've taken the test. It looks like most of you have taken the test. A few of you have not taken the test. So if you have not taken the test, let me just, for those of you who haven't, let me just give you a little bit of information about what you need to know. Let me introduce myself first, now that we're all in the room and getting to know each other. I'm Crista Cowan. I'm the corporate genealogist here at Ancestry. Some of you may know me as the Barefoot Genealogist. That's the name of my YouTube series on the Ancestry YouTube channel. So I have, over the last decade, more than a decade, become an expert in genetic genealogy. So using AncestryDNA to make family history discoveries. And so I'm particularly positioned to teach this class and excited to talk to you about family history. So for the few of you, it looks like, who have not taken an AncestryDNA test, there are, you order the test online. So you just go to Ancestry.com and you can order a DNA test. When you order the test, it's going to give you the opportunity to spit in a tube. Super gross, but that's how it works. So it only is about 1/4 teaspoon of saliva. You don't want to eat or drink or smoke anything for about an hour. It says 20 minutes, but I like to give it an hour before you take the test. If you want to get really fancy, you can take your cheeks and just kind of rub them against your gums and let the saliva pool in the bottom of your mouth and then provide the sample. Okay, so super simple. There's a blue solution that's a preservation solution. You're going to screw that cap onto the tube after you've put the saliva sample into it. Then you're going to shake it up, and that's going to preserve that DNA in that tube. Then you're just going to follow the activation instructions on the card that's provided, on the box that's provided, and then mail that back in the return mailer that is also provided. That's going to get sent off to a lab with an anonymous number on it. The lab is going to process your DNA sample. That can take anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks. So just be prepared that there's a little bit of a waiting period. You provide enough of a sample for us to test it multiple times in case there's any problems along the way. And we make 3 attempts. And when your results are ready, we deliver them to your Ancestry account. Now, if you've never had an Ancestry account before, you don't have a tree, you've never taken a test, the process of activating your test creates a free registered guest account. And that's going to allow you to log in to Ancestry and view your DNA results. Okay, so we'll get into what the results look like in just a minute, but I'm going to share my screen again. Emily, I'm not sure why your face is showing up on my screen. I don't know if it's showing up on everybody's screen. I'm not sure how that's working for everybody, if people are seeing me or not, but I'm seeing Emily, so not sure what's going on there. Okay, there we go. She's gone. Awesome. Okay, not that it's awesome that Emily's gone. She's great. We are going to talk first about DNA inheritance, but I need to get rid of this screen. There we go. Okay, so DNA inheritance is super fascinating to me. Again, I am not a science and math person, but when I started getting into DNA, there were just some basic science facts I needed to understand. Here are the basic science facts you need to understand in order to start to wrap your brain around DNA. Every person, male or female, inherits 50% of their DNA from their dad and 50% of their DNA from their mom, okay? And that is true universally, okay, among humans. 50% of dad's DNA, 50% of mom's DNA. But you do not inherit a 50-50 split of all of their DNA. You inherit a random 50% of their DNA. You'll see why that's important in just a minute. So your DNA has a ton of information. As a matter of fact, Ancestry tests around 700,000 places on your DNA. So you have 22 pairs of autosomal chromosomes. In those pairs, you got one from mom, one from dad, and Ancestry looks at 700,000 locations on those 22 chromosomes. But we're going to use a really stripped down, simplified example or analogy to help you understand this concept of random inheritance. Okay, so if I scroll down, we are going to imagine that we have someone whose DNA is spelled out and it makes the name Andrew. We made it 6 letters so that we could very conveniently pass on 50% of them, okay? So we have someone whose DNA name is Andrew, And he and his wife, Sandra, have some children. Now, remember, he can only pass half of his DNA on to his child, and Sandra can only pass half of her DNA on to her child. So this couple is going to have a child. They're each going to pass on 50% of their DNA. That DNA is going to get recombined, and his name is going to be Edward. So do we see how that happens? Half of Andrew's DNA, half of Sandra's DNA. This child's name then is Edward. Now we're going to have another couple here, Graham and Elaine. And Graham and Elaine are going to have a child. Again, half of their DNA is going to get passed on, and that child is going to become Angela. Okay, still with me? Now, Edward and Angela are going to get married, and they're going to have children of their own. Now, they're going to have 3 children, and each time they have a child, 50% of their DNA is going to get passed on to the child. But, and this is the important part, it is a random 50% every time. So one child is going to be named Glenda, and one child is going to be named Reagan, and one child is going to be named Gerald. Do we see how that happens? So the first lesson of DNA is everybody inherits 50% of their DNA from dad, 50% of their DNA from mom, but it is a random 50%. And every time a new child is born to that couple, it is another random 50%. So unless you are an identical twin, you and your siblings will not have identical DNA. Your DNA will look similar. We can tell you are the child of these parents because you have half their DNA. We can tell these people are siblings. So let's look at this a little bit closer. All 3 of these children inherited a G from mom. So they have that in common. All 3 of these children inherited an A from dad. So they have that in common. 2 of these children inherited an N from mom. 2 of these children inherited an R from dad, right? So there's overlap, but it is not identical unless you are identical twins. So what does that mean for you when you are thinking about taking an AncestryDNA test or looking at your AncestryDNA results? What it means is that unless Edward and Angela are both available to test, that if you test, you are only representing 50% of your parents' DNA. But if you have siblings who can test, you'll get more of your parents' DNA represented by testing your siblings. Now, if Edward and Angela are both available to test them. As a matter of fact, if Graham and Elaine up here are available to test, or Andrew and Sandra are available to test them, right? We always want to test the oldest living generation. I had the opportunity before, I had one living grandparent when DNA testing came out, and I tested her at her 90th birthday party, and she was confused a little bit about what I possibly thought DNA was going to tell me, but she was tickled that I was interested in her family history and learning more about her. And so she provided the sample willingly so that we could get her tested. And I'm so glad that we did, because my dad only got half of her DNA. And I only got a random half of my dad's DNA, which means I've only got about a quarter of my grandmother's DNA in me if I was the only one who tested. But because I was able to test her, I was able to have more DNA represented. Now, my grandfather had already passed. And so I have 100% of her DNA because she tested, but I have none of my grandfather's DNA. So I tested my dad. My dad has 50% of his dad's DNA. So we tested my dad's siblings, and now we have most of my grandfather's DNA represented. Now, there's another couple of interesting things when you start to look at this way. For example, right, we talked about how some things get passed down generation after generation after generation, but there are some things that get lost. For example, do you see how Andrew has this N and this W, and Sandra has this S, and Graham has an H and an M, and Elaine has an I, right? Like they have these little pieces of DNA. And in some cases, they passed some of those things down. Edward got the W, but he didn't get the N. He didn't get his mom's S, right? And then in the next generation, Edward did not pass that W on to any of his children. So that W is now completely lost in that branch of the family tree. Now, it's totally possible Andrew and Sandra had another child, the W got passed on to that child passed it on to his children. So it may exist in a first cousin or a second cousin, but it's not going to exist in this branch of the family tree. So again, start to think about what that means for you and your DNA results. I will tell you, there's a little math problem here for those of you who are math nerds, like I am becoming, and like my dad totally is. It is that if you have one child, they get 50% of your DNA. Your second child also gets 50% of your DNA, but when you look at the DNA of those two children together, it makes up about 75% of your DNA. A third child gets 50% of your DNA, but when you look at all three of those children together, it's going to be about 87 or 88% of your DNA. When you have a fourth child, they get 50% of your DNA, but when you look at them all in totality, they're going to have about 93% of your DNA. When you have a fifth child, right? So the more children that a couple has, and 5 to 6 is about the spot mathematically where you have almost 100% of a couple's DNA represented. But if you have multiple siblings, you want to test as many of them as possible and as many as are willing in order to represent the full scope of your grandparent or of your parents' DNA. Now, think about your grandparents. If your grandparents are not available for testing, who else might have inherited that W? Is it an uncle? Is it a first cousin? Is it grandpa's brother, right? So who else in the family could test in order to show this complete DNA for a particular generation? So I hope that that makes sense. Again, that kind of random inheritance of DNA. DNA is a lot more complex than just 6 letters. I mentioned that we look at 700,000 locations across all of your autosomal chromosomes. So chromosomes 1 through 22. And that then is going to, the random combination of 700,000 provides obviously a lot more combinations. So think about not just who you have tested, if you've tested and look at your match list and see who else in your family has tested, think really intentionally about who else could test, that when you look at your results in combination, that you can get more results or more information available. So that is random inheritance of DNA. Before I move on to show you my results, I'm just going to take a quick peek at the Q&A and just see if there's anything I can answer. Okay. The link for that, so let me just pull this up again. The link for that, let me put it in the chat. And that way, if you want the link, you can grab it and go look at this for yourself. You can also show it to your family members so you can explain to them why you might need them to help test. Okay. Let's see. Recessive genes. So Roseanne's asking about recessive genes. Dominant and recessive genes do not play into the conversation about autosomal DNA for family history. So we don't spend a lot of time talking about that. Christine's asking, can you get DNA from, in this case, so someone's ashes or hair or artifacts, right? Currently, DNA can only be collected for AncestryDNA purposes from a living person who provides their own sample. And we need them, all adults have to activate their own test. So we need them to provide informed consent for the testing process and the results process. If you have a minor child, and you are the parent or legal guardian, you can test them, but all adults have to agree to test themselves. And so you need to be really specific about that when you're talking to people. They're going to have to test, they're going to have to activate their own kit. Now, we will talk in just a minute about how they can share those results with you if they want, so that you can manage the test for them, but they would need to activate the test for themselves. Okay, and then I saw another question I wanted to answer. You guys are asking questions fast and furious. I love it. We do have some fabulous team members from our member services who are going to answer some of these questions just in one-off. But okay, so a couple of people have asked questions around, like, if I'm an only child, what is it going to show me? Well, it's still going to show you any second or third or fourth or fifth cousins who have DNA tested. You're still going to be matched to people. I have been doing this for for over 12 years now, and I have looked at thousands of DNA results, and I can honestly say I have never heard of one instance where somebody got 0 matches. Doesn't matter where in the world you're from, everybody gets matches. And really, it's another math problem. I geek out about this stuff. So I love the math of it. Think about it this way. You have 2 parents and 4 grandparents and 8 greats and 16 great-greats and 32 great-great-greats, 64 4 times great, 128 5 times greats, okay? So by the time you get back to your 5 times great-grandparents, for most of us, we're looking at about the mid-1700s or so. Now, what if you were to take all of those people? That's a super easy math problem too. You just double it with each generation. But what if you were to take those 128 5 times great-grandparents and start to trace all of their descendants? Who were their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren? So if you came down to your generation through every one of their children, those people would be your 6th cousins. And I suspect that most of us have tens of thousands of 6th cousins. Now, you're not going to share DNA with all of them, because remember the W, right? It comes down in some branches of the tree and not in others. And so by the time you get to about 3rd cousins, you could have 4th and 5th and 6th cousins that you just don't share any DNA with. But there are tens of thousands of them, and you are going to share DNA with some of them. So the whole idea behind DNA matching, which we'll talk about here in just a minute in a little bit more detail, is you will receive matches. But if you're an only child, who else can you ask to test? Do you have any living aunts or uncles? Do you have any living first cousins on either side of your family tree? Okay, so kind of start to think through some of that. Okay, let's talk about your origins. So when you take the DNA test and you get your results back, one of the first things that people want to look at is their origins. And origins are showing you where in the world your DNA has been. So you're going to see a breakdown of regions. And those regions are going to have a percentage next to them. And so what that's telling me is that my DNA, 60% of it matches people from this region. And 16% of it matches people from this region, and so on, okay? Now, here's how Ancestry gets those regions. We have a team of amazing scientists, population geneticists, and all sorts of people who are really good at making sure that they understand migrations of people over time and understand what that DNA looks like. So they have spent years and done research studies and collected research studies that have been done elsewhere and created a reference panel. So it's a population of people that represent these different regions in the world. When we started 12 years ago, that reference panel wasn't very big. Every year, as more studies are done, as more data becomes available, that reference panel grows. And as that reference panel grows, then Your DNA doesn't change, but your regions might adjust a little bit. Now, most people, nobody that I know, is going to go from being European and part African to being part Asian, right? So when you look at a broad level, that continentally, those regions are going to be pretty consistent. But within a particular continent, you might see shifting, sometimes big shifting. So here's an analogy that I've been kicking around to help people understand this. If you were a blue dot, and the only thing we had to compare you to was a green dot and a red dot, what do you think we would tell you looked more like? Probably the green dot, because that's all we had to compare you against. But now let's say we throw in a shade of turquoise and a yellow, and we grow that reference panel. And now we're looking at you and we're saying, oh, well, you know what? You look a little bit like the green dot, but you also look a little bit like the turquoise dot. And then we start to throw in different shades of blue. And now we have to decide which of those shades of blue you look like in what percentages. So again, it's not that you change, your DNA stays the same, but as that reference panel grows and we're comparing you to that reference population, we can get a little bit more granular, a little bit more precise about exactly what your DNA looks like. So this does change. As a matter of fact, we just updated the AncestryDNA regions a couple of weeks ago. And so it's important to know that as your regions change, your DNA is not changing, our reference panel is just growing. It also means that our science team is getting better and better at understanding exactly how to compare you to that reference population and how to provide that information in a way that is going to allow you to understand yourself a little bit better. So that is what we're doing with that change that happens. It typically happens once a year, and it typically is published in the fall. However, some of you may notice as you're looking at yours that your date of your last update says like June or July or August. That's because the science team takes all summer to rerun those and refine them. And then we just publish them to everyone when they're all done. So your date, I saw that question, your date may look a little different, but we still only update that about once a year. And again, typically in Northern Hemisphere's fall, okay? Here's the other thing you need to know about Ancestry DNA origins, particularly your regions. Your regions are looking at where in the world your DNA was 500 to 1,000 years ago. Now, I don't know about you, but my family tree does not go back that far on, I don't think any of the branch. I think I may have one branch that goes back to 1500, one tiny little branch. But the rest of my tree, I get stuck in the 1860s in some places, okay? Like, I know who all 4 of my grandparents are. I know who all 8 of my great-grandparents are. I know who all 16 of my 2 times great-grandparents are. But I only know 30 of my 3 times great-grandparents. And I think I only know, I don't even know. I have the numbers, right? So the idea, as a matter of fact, I'll publish my numbers. I'll write a blog post about that so that I can get that out there and you can start to understand that like you identify sometimes so strongly with, oh, I'm German, or oh, I'm Scottish, or oh, I'm French, or oh, I'm Nigerian, or oh, I'm Puerto Rican, like whatever it is that you identify as. And typically that's because we're looking at our grandparents or our great-grandparents and where they were from. But you have to think about the fact that DNA regions is looking at something much, much older than that. Okay, now let me share my screen again so that we can keep going, because you also then have, in addition to your regions, some of you will have journeys. So it's another little tab here on the origins tab. Journeys are calculated a little differently. So journeys are calculated by looking at all of your DNA matches and all of the family tree data on Ancestry and denoting exactly where in the world those clusters of matches have lived within the last couple hundred years. So if you have a whole bunch of matches and they all come from the same place, we can start to figure out exactly what the migration path was, whether that was voluntary or forced migration. We can start to figure out where they may have landed and lived for a period of time. So let's take a look at my journeys. I only have a couple. So my first one here is Upper Early South Settlers. And you'll notice it covers most of the state of Tennessee and goes all the way over to Arkansas. If I knew nothing about my family history, if I was brand new to family history, if I had just taken a DNA test, this is the space where all of a sudden I start learning something really significant and meaningful to my family history. Because now all of a sudden I am connected within the last couple hundred years to a very specific spot on the map. Now, I happen to know quite a bit about my family history. As a matter of fact, you can tell that because there's these little bubbles with numbers on them. That's telling me that there are 21 of my ancestors and 17 of my ancestors and 14 of my ancestors in my family tree that were born in these places. So Ancestry didn't need to know that about me, but they did. So they're going to overlay that onto this region that's showing up because of the network of DNA matches that I connect to. I can then drill into this. I can click on it. I can learn more about it. You can click on anywhere you see a little arrow, or if you move your mouse over it, if it turns into a blue underlined link, you can click on any one of these things and it's going to give you additional information. And I encourage you to do that. Explore the journeys. Some of you, in addition to journeys, will also have ethnic regions. Explore those, click on those. We have a team of content creators who have done a beautiful job curating information about these places, about these journeys, about typical migration patterns. So again, if you know nothing about your family history, if you're just getting started, this is an opportunity to start to build a framework for your family story, for exactly how these things have come into your family. Now, if you also have an Ancestry subscription, any family history subscription, any level, you can see which side of your family tree you inherited your journeys from, you inherited your regions from, ultimately what you inherited, where you inherited your matches from. So even if you don't have a parent to test, we can tell you, oh, this is one side and this is the other side. Hopefully you'll be able to know which is which. So in my case, I knew which was which, and I just went in and edited the label. And so now in lots of places, as I start to explore my family history, it says, oh, you got this from your mother's side. So then it's going to show me these people in my family tree that are from those places, and I can explore that and then some of my matches. So click around, be willing to just explore your regions, your journeys, all of that information. And then if you have an Ancestry subscription, you can also explore that by parent. Now, I only have 2 journeys. My other one comes from my father's side of the family, and in fact, more specifically, from his mother's side of the family. Just so happens that's the grandma I was able to test, and it connects me to this place. And so again, some of you may have, a few of you may have no journeys yet. Some of you may have several and lots of things to explore and start to understand. So let's just do a quick recap. When you are in your DNA origins, you're going to get your regions, your ancestral regions. So this is the things with percentages next to them. It's showing you where in the world your DNA likely was 500 to 1,000 years ago. When you are looking at your journeys, what you are looking at is where you have family who has lived within the last few hundred years. So ancestors in my case, or some of you, it just maybe you have a whole bunch of cousins who migrated to a place and that connects you to that place, but you have family who has lived there within the last 200 to 300 years. Okay, I'm going to take a quick pause and just see what questions we've got about this that I can answer. Y'all are asking good questions. Okay, so somebody's asking, how do you figure out who is parent 1 and who is parent 2? So again, Ancestry can assign your regions and your journeys to a parent, but all we know is that this is one half of your pairs of chromosomes, and this is the other half of your pairs of chromosomes. Your DNA doesn't come labeled in your body, mom's side, dad's side. So we just label it parent 1, parent 2. And it's just kind of random, okay? So it's not parent 1 could be mom or parent 1 could be dad, and it's different for everybody. So you have to look at it and see if you can make a decision. Now, in my case, and I'll show you what this looks like, in my case, my parents are very genetically similar. So you see here, both of them have huge swaths of England, and my dad has some Scotland and my mom has some Scotland, and it looks like my mom has lots of Ireland and my dad has a little bit of Ireland. And so if I didn't know which parent was which, it might be a little difficult to tell just from the regions. But then as you click down into the journeys, because I do know a little bit about my family history, I knew that of my 4 grandparents, only one of them has any connection to Utah. So it was very easy to say, oh, that must be my dad's side. Also, none of my dad's family is from the South, and all of my mom's family is from the South. Both of her parents were born right in the corner of this journey, and their parents, and they, the family has lived there since 1831, and before 1831, they migrated there from Eastern Tennessee. So this is very clearly my mother's side of the family, but that's because I know a little bit about my family history. So when you're trying to decide which parent is which, if you know some things about your family history, it should be easier to figure out. If you don't know anything about your family history, you're going to want to go to your match list and look and see who of my family members that I know have already tested and matched me. And if it's a first cousin on dad's side, now you know that's dad's side. So as soon as you figure it out anywhere and edit the label and make parent 1 either mom or dad, then everywhere it will update those labels so that then you could come back here and take a look at that and it will show you which parent is which. Okay, let's see. So the question is just asking a clarifying question. Are journeys coming from DNA or from trees? So journeys are coming from DNA. So everybody in Ancestry's tested more than 25 million people that have taken the test. Those 25 million people, every time a new person gets tested, they get compared against those people and show up on the match lists of the people that they match. Well, what starts happening when you have that many people who've tested is you start seeing clusters of networks of matches that start to form. And we can see that in the data. And then we can take those clusters. So the cluster is formed entirely based on DNA. But then we can take that cluster of a few hundred or a few thousand people, and we can say, what do these people all have in common? Why do they all match each other? And because then many of those people will have family trees, we can start to look at some of that data to see, can we connect this cluster of people to a specific place on the map? Okay, so that is how that is derived. Okay, a couple of people are asking about why certain DNA doesn't show up. So I've seen several questions here about particularly Indigenous American. So Ancestry has one of the largest populations of Indigenous Americans in our reference panel. So if you have Indigenous DNA, it will show up in your results. We can't break it down by tribe. That's not how that works, but we used to just show Indigenous American like north and south covering the whole thing. But then as that reference panel has grown over time, we were able to then split it out into North and South America, and then North and Central and South America, and then, like kind of the Inuit people and some of the Canadian First Nations people. And so now we've got multiple regions that account for Indigenous Americans across all of North and South America. So if you have Indigenous DNA, it absolutely will show up in your DNA results. Two things to keep in mind. One, I'm not going to call grandma a liar, but my grandma told us stories my whole life that her husband and his family were Indigenous. Our whole lives, we heard that. You look at my grandfather, you're like, oh, he looks Indigenous. I can totally understand that. My mom took the DNA test, her sisters, her cousins, nobody is coming up with any Indigenous DNA. I'm digging into the family tree. We did have a brick wall there. We thought maybe it was behind that brick wall. We've disproven that fact. Now, he lived in Indian Territory. He was born and raised in Northwest Arkansas. And they were around Indigenous people a lot, and they lived on or near reservation lands, and different cousins married into the family that were Indigenous, and so they kind of connected with this identity. And then, like a game of telephone, the story just gets morphed over time until all of a sudden, oh, Grandpa was born in what was at the time called Indian Territory, to now Grandpa is Native American. And it's just a game of telephone that happens in a lot of families. So for many of us, we take that DNA test and we realize, oh, I don't have any Indigenous DNA. And then as we start doing the family history research, we discover we don't really. Now, that's one scenario. The other scenario is your Indigenous DNA could be the W. Remember, you only get half of your parents' DNA, and it's a random 50%, which means you're not going to inherit 50% of every one of their ethnicities. You're going to inherit a random 50% of their ethnicities. And if that Indigenous ancestor is back 3, 4, 5 generations, and it was just one person, and they weren't even 100% Indigenous because the Indigenous people here in North America have been intermixing with Europeans for 400 years, then it's possible that you just didn't inherit that piece of DNA from that one ancestor out of the 128 in that generation. So look to the cousins, see who else may have inherited that piece of DNA, or look to the records to make sure that that really is a true story. And that's true, like Indigenous is the one that gets people most emotional, but that's true of any ethnicity. People are like, oh, I'm Scottish. Why don't I have any Scottish DNA? Oh, I'm French. Why don't I have any French DNA? Well, just because somebody lives in a place doesn't mean they absorb the DNA of that place. DNA is identified based on some really clear genetic information that connects people to that population of people who were from that place hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And when you look at maps of Europe in particular, you see all the migration in and out, the different wars that happened. So I have family that lived in Poland, in what is now Poland, for hundreds of years, but they're not Polish, they're German, right? And so borders move across people more than people moved across borders for a long time. And so we think in terms of geopolitical borders, but really populations of people can live in lots of places. And so think about that as well when you start to think about, why am I missing this DNA? Okay. Okay, lots of really great questions. Let's talk about your DNA settings for a minute, and then we're going to wrap up by talking about matches. You guys are asking fantastic questions. I wish I had time to answer every one of them. It looks like our member services team is doing a fantastic job keeping up with the questions that you are asking. And of course, we do have other resources. So stick around to the end, and I'll provide you with a few additional ways that you can continue to get some education and get your questions answered. So let's talk about your DNA settings. Up here in the top right corner of your Ancestry account, you have your account information, and you're going to want to go to your account settings. When you go to account settings, over here on the left, then you're going to click on the DNA tab. So all of your DNA settings are going to be found in your account settings under DNA. Now, I happen to manage or have viewer or collaborator access to tests for lots of other family members and other people who've shared their results with me. I only own my test, okay? And so I'm going to click on my name, and you're going to see my information, and I'm okay with that. So this is the information that you put in when you activated the test, and it can be changed. Like if you accidentally listed your date of birth wrong or your sex wrong, you can adjust that if you need to update it or correct it. The second section on your DNA settings, this is super important. So if you have not already done this, this is your homework for our time together today, which is you want to link your DNA results to your family tree. If you haven't started a family tree yet, that's super easy. I showed you how to do that last week. If you missed last week's webinar, you can go to the Ancestry YouTube channel, and there's a whole family tree building 101 class from last week where I walk you step by step through how to do that. Okay, once you've done that, come back here and do this. If you've already started your tree, you're going to want to attach, so just click this little DNA link button here. You're going to link this DNA test that you took to you in your tree. So you always want to attach the person who took the test to the person in the tree who took the test, okay? Sometimes people get confused about that. One of the reasons people get confused about that is because they don't have a tree with themselves in it. They started the tree with mom or grandma. No, your tree starts with you, then your parents and your grandparents. And if that's all you know and that's all you can put in the tree, do that. And then link your DNA to your tree. That is going to allow Ancestry to provide you with more tools, more resources, more features that are going to work in your benefit to help you make more family history discoveries. You can do it without a tree, but it makes it harder for you, and it makes it harder for your DNA matches. They then have to go build your family tree, and then you don't even know they're building your family tree. They're trying to figure out how they're related to you and if that's going to help inform them about more about their family history. So even if all you do is yourself, your parents, and your grandparents, link your DNA to your tree, you're going to see some really cool things that start to pop up in your results. Okay. If you just scroll through the rest of the settings, this is just going to tell you what you can and can't do and what you can and can't see, and you can review those at any time. And then there's a section here called DNA test sharing. So just briefly, I want to talk about why you might want to share your DNA results. So we started the top of the hour talking about random DNA inheritance and how you're going to want to test multiple people in your family in order to get 100% of your parents' or grandparents' DNA represented or as close as possible. And every adult has to activate their own test because they have to provide this informed consent, right? They have to have control over that and access to providing that consent and then updating those permissions if they choose. But we want access to each other's results. So you can, or your matches can at any time, go into this DNA test sharing, and you can share your test results with your family members, with that second cousin who's trying to work with you to figure out who your common great-grandparents are, or with your brother because you want access to his results and you need his match list to compare with yours to see if you can figure out who that third great-grandfather is that's your brick wall, right? So there's lots of ways that those results can be used together, and DNA test sharing is how you do that. Now, there are 3 levels of permission. One is just a viewer, so they can just view your test results. One is a collaborator. That means that they can view your test results, and on your match list, they can leave notes, they can help group people. So it's a way to work together to figure some things out. And then the third level of permission is to make somebody a manager. So if you, for example, in the case of my grandmother, tested her. She was 90 years old. She had a computer, but she didn't ever really use it. And then her health declined very quickly after that, and eventually she passed. Luckily, I was given manager rights to her test. So I can now access her test on my account. I never have to log into her account. I don't even have the login information. As a matter of fact, I don't know if anybody does because she passed away. But I have access to all of her results directly on my account. And I have become the manager of those results, which also means when people message her, those messages come to me. It means when anybody sees her test results in their list, it says DM managed by Crista Cowan. And so everybody knows, oh, Crista's managing these results. So those are the 3 levels of permission when you share your test results with somebody or when you invite someone to share their test results with you. And all of that is handled here through the DNA test sharing in your DNA settings. So again, you're going to want to become familiar with those settings and make sure that you have everything set up just like you want. That DNA test sharing spot is also where you're going to be able to go to remove people's access. So if you've shared it with a cousin and you've worked on a problem and you've figured it out, and then you don't want them to have access anymore, that's just fine. You can do that as well. Okay, let me now, for our last few minutes together, to the Ancestry DNA match list. So all of that information is interesting and it's useful. And there's other things like go explore your traits. If you manage other tests or if tests have been shared with you, you can just click on your name here and it will give you a drop-down list and you can switch to the other tests. And you can do that from any of these tabs here. So you can navigate your way through all of those results. But for those of us who took the Ancestry DNA test because we want to learn more about our family history, whether you're looking for your biological parents because you were adopted, or you're looking for an unknown father or grandfather, or whether, like me, you know who your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents are, but you get back one more generation and you've got a brick wall, and you're trying to bust through that brick wall and figure out who is this person and who were his parents. The DNA match list is the gold. Now, learning how to group your matches, understand what centimorgans mean, all of that is a little bit of DNA 201, right? We were in DNA 101 today. We'll look at putting together some more classes, but for now, there are videos out on the Ancestry YouTube channel that can help you find biological family using Ancestry DNA or learn how to create custom groups out of your matches. But I'm just going to run through the layout of the page today, again, at a very 101 level, so that you understand what it is you're looking at and how to navigate some of these things. You're going to see my live matches. This is my actual match list. Luckily, a lot of my immediate family has tested and they've all given me permission to teach classes like this and show this. So as we scroll down the match list, if you have a parent or child who has tested, those are going to be the first people that show up in your match list. In my case, I've tested both of my parents. The good news is they are both my parents, okay? And sometimes we have to have those conversations with people before we invite them to test, or when we invite them to test, we need to just let them know, like, there could be surprises that happen, because I say this all the time, but all families are messy. Families have always been messy, right? So if you're feeling a little hesitation or there's some surprises that come up, just know you are completely not alone. Now, I have 4 full siblings, so we all have the same 2 parents, and I tested all of them, not because I needed to. So genealogically, I had already tested both of my parents, so we have 100% of their DNA, and their DNA is who I'm working with to figure out our ancestors. But my siblings were curious, and they wanted to see how much of what they inherited and which traits they got and which journeys they ended up with. And so they all wanted to test. And so you'll see each of them listed here. That's the second category. Now, those 2 categories are pretty clear. Like, we can tell pretty clearly, this is your parent or your child, this is your full sibling. When you start to get to the next category, which is what we call close family, This is the people that you share about 25% of your DNA with. And there are multiple relationships that this person could be. So you're going to share about 25% of your DNA with a half sibling because you only have one parent in common, not two. You're going to share about half of your DNA with a grandparent or a grandchild because it gets cut in half with each generation. And so about 25% of your DNA, grandparent, grandchild. You're going to share about 25% of your DNA with an aunt or an uncle or a niece or nephew. So you share 50% with your parent, they share 50% with their sibling, their full sibling. You're going to share about 25% of your DNA with that person. So sure enough, this is my dad's brother, this is my dad's sister, this is my mom's sister, and this is my grandma, my dad's mom. So those relationships are the ones that are going to start to show up in the top of the list if those people have tested. Now you're going to get down, the next chunk of matches is going to be people that you share around 12% of your DNA with. So that's going to be, again, every generation it gets cut in half. That's going to be your first cousins. That's going to be any half aunts or uncles. So your parents' half siblings. That's going to be, who else? Great nieces and nephews with great aunts and uncles. So your grandparents' brothers and sisters. So like start to think about like, who are the possible people that could be in this? And if you know these people, great. If you don't know these people, that gets a little trickier. So these are all my first cousins. Well, they're not all my first cousins. Let me rephrase that. All of the people on this list are my first cousins, but it's not all of my first cousins. So we've got my dad, like these are my first cousins on my dad's side. And then these, she and this guy down here are the first cousins on my mom's side. So I only have 2 first cousins on my mom's side, 7 on my dad's side. But this woman right here showed up right in the middle of my DNA match list of my cousins. Well, it turns out she's my mom's half sister. So that was the first surprise that we had in our family tree. We did not know my mom had a half sister. She's about 10 years older than my mom. She's a delightful woman. She's my new Aunt Carol, and I love her. I've now been to her home. I've been to family reunions with her. But having her show up in the middle of this list of my cousins, I had to figure some things out, and we were able to do that. And then we get down to the next generation. So this right here is my dad's first cousin. So he's my first cousin, one time removed, because again, the DNA gets cut in half every time you drop a generation. So here is my challenge to you. I'm not going to make it a homework assignment, but if you have already taken the AncestryDNA test, I want you to go through those matches. So your first 20 matches, that's how many appear on your first page. And I want you to see if you can identify who every single one of them is. And if you can just update this relationship. So we give you a prediction, but you can actually update it if you know for sure who that person is. Parents and children, full siblings, those should already all be labeled. But again, once you get down to this close family bucket, Ancestry tells you what we think the relationship is, but you can figure out exactly what the relationship is. And that's what I want to challenge you to do with that first 20 matches. Because if you can get those first 20 matches figured out, then when you start digging into the rest of the matches, and again, this is AncestryDNA 201, when you start digging into the rest of the matches, you're going to understand a little bit better about how you're related to those people, because you'll know which of these people they also match. Okay. Okay. Well, that is what I have for you today. Let me give you a couple of just ending announcements. Before you go, would you please, in the chat, not the Q&A, but in the chat, would you let me know, type out one new thing you learned today? There's 2 reasons I ask you to do this. One is because I want to know what you're learning and what's valuable to people. That's super helpful for me. The other reason is I fully believe that the act of like articulating and typing out what you learned means you're more likely to remember it. Repetition is one of the best learners, so we will have this recording available. But even just typing it out, I think is going to help you learn a little bit more. So I'm seeing lots of stuff flow in and I love it. I think this is fantastic. I love showing up here and serving you and teaching you, and I want to keep doing that. So we are still in the thick of National Family History Month here at Ancestry, which means next Wednesday, same time, same place. You'll have a different Zoom link, but same time, we are going to be doing Ancestry search tips and tricks. So last week we did Family Tree Building 101, and you can go watch that video on the Ancestry YouTube channel if you haven't already seen it, or if you need a refresher. This week we did AncestryDNA 101. And so next week we're going to creep up just a little bit, not quite to a 201 level class, but we're going to talk about just basic search tips and tricks, and then some of my favorite search tips and tricks. Because Ancestry has more than 60 billion records on our site to help you figure out how you're related to those DNA matches, to help you figure out who grandpa's parents were, like all of that is in those family history records. And so I'll come back here next week to spend an hour with you to teach you a little bit more about how to use search and hints to make some of those discoveries for yourself. So that's what I've got for you today. I still see tons of responses rolling in. I love it. Keep them coming. And until next time, I'm Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.